Welcome to the National Gallery. My name is David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer here. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the Christmas story in art and various ways that artists depicted scenes that relate to the Nativity, the birth of Christ, and the related episodes. Almost everything that I'm going to be showing you today is in the permanent collection here at the National Gallery. So after we finish here, if you want, you might want to stroll through the galleries and see the paintings in their real situation, especially starting, I think, with the Italian collection, which is literally Gallery 1, and walking through chronologically, and then from the Italian Renaissance going into the Northern Flemish Renaissance as well. So almost everything that I'll show today is in the gallery. A couple of things are missing because we've loaned them to other museums for exhibitions. So let's get started. The first thing that anybody does in thinking about how artists depicted certain scenes related, in this case, to Christmas or the Nativity, is to understand the various sources that artists use. What were they looking at and reading? What did they understand? What sources were they familiar with? And obviously, for our topic, the first place one would start would be, of course, with the New Testament, with the Bible. And the Bible refers only to actually to only 7 events that relate to Jesus as a child, or as a baby, or as a young boy. Only 7 events. And in the 4 canonical Gospels, only 2 of the evangelists actually mention episodes that relate to the birth of Christ and the so-called Christmas story. In Matthew, we find a mention of the Magi coming to pay their respects. That's in Matthew. And then in Luke, we find the Annunciation to the shepherds, so that's canonical. But Matthew and Luke don't share those. So in other words, the Magi story is only in Matthew, it's not in Luke, and the shepherd story is only in Luke, it's not in Matthew, but those are considered canonical sources. Now, the 4 Gospels were not the only sources for artists, and so we have to talk about what we can refer to as non-canonical. They're not part of the canon of the books of the Bible. And so here we confront, and I'm showing you a range of these on the screen right now. The first and the most important would be what we refer to as the Apocrypha. These were apocryphal writings that didn't make, shall we say, they didn't make the cut to be canonical in the Gospels that we know, although there was a lot of discussion and debate about these things. And so there's the Christian apocryphal writings, which includes the Gnostic Gospels. So Gospels that were not accepted, but that the stories were well known to artists, include stories that come from the infancy Gospel of James, the pseudo-Matthew Gospel of Thomas, pseudo-Matthew Gospel, the Gospel according to Thomas, the Gospel according to Mary Magdalene. These are all apocryphal Gospels that didn't make it into the sort of the approved canon of the Bible, of the New Testament. So we have the Apocrypha and the Gnostic Gospels. By the way, that I'm showing you on the lower left there, the cover of a book titled The Gnostic Gospels, and you can see Elaine Pagel's name. She did not write the Gnostic Gospels, but I'm showing you that because she is the absolute best writer and historian and commentator on the Gnostic Gospels. Her writings are just absolutely brilliant, and if you're interested in that topic, that's the book to start with. So then, once we get beyond the canonical Gospels, get beyond the apocryphal, we come to theological writings that were written years later, and certain saints, certain writers were important to the story that we're discussing. The first would be St. Jerome, and then St. Francis and St. Bridget, those 3 in particular, each of whom wrote homilies, remembrances, etc. And you can see those listed there on the top as we go across Revelations, especially St. Bridget's Revelations. So those are theological writings that came out and sort of elaborated on the story and sometimes altered the story. And then we get to a source that's represented on the book on the lower right, which is a popular, we might call it popular legend in literature, and the most important book is The Golden Legend, which is written by Jacobus Voragine, and that was published in somewhere between 1259 and 1266. The stories of the saints, especially the life of Mary, there are many, many episodes in the Golden Legend that really captured the imagination of artists. So that's a very important source. And then if we keep kind of diminishing in terms of importance, we end up with what we might call folk tales, stories people tell that could vary from country to country, region to region. And then we could even include stories that we all know today and sort of came about in the 20th century and more contemporary times. For example, if you know the opera by Menotti, Amal and the Night Visitors, that's a story, but that's of course just an imaginative story about this episode. But the one that I always refer to is The Drummer Boy, and of course he wasn't there, in case you're wondering. But we like this story, we like that song, and we like that whole kind of thing, and so that's fine. That's kind of like a popular story that comes out and we discuss and sort of enjoy. That cartoon on the right is from the New Yorker. But let's get to something more serious. So, this is a painting that is in our permanent collection. It's the Nativity, flanked by Saints Isaiah and Ezekiel. This painting is always in Gallery 1, but it is not right now because it is in London for an exhibition that started at the Met back in January, a wonderful exhibition on Sienese painting in the 1300s, and so this painting is very important. We loaned this painting to the Metropolitan, and now it's gone on to the next venue, which is the National Gallery in London. So unfortunately, this is a painting you won't be able to see in the gallery. So we have the Nativity in the center, we have the birth of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, the Christ child, the ox and the ass, all of that sort of standard imagery, the angels. Now, a couple of things here, well, more than a couple. First of all, why would we have Isaiah and Ezekiel, who are Old Testament prophets, flanking a New Testament subject of the Nativity? And of course, this is what it's called in this kind of study, a typology. And what that simply means is it was very important during this period, all through the centuries, from the time of Christ up to the later centuries, it was important to establish the fact that the prophecies of the Old Testament foretold what was going to happen in the New Testament. So that's what's going on here, placing Isaiah and Ezekiel next to the Nativity. Each character holds a scroll. We can read what's on the scroll. It's in Latin, not in Greek. And in the case of Isaiah at the left, he's quoting from his prophecy, Isaiah 7:14, which I'm sure you all know. It's, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." So that's what's on his scroll. So he's foretelling, an Old Testament prophet is foretelling the birth of Christ. And then Ezekiel's scroll, which again we can read, is Ezekiel 44:2, and this is his message is affirming the virginity, shall we say, of Mary, and it reads, "This gate shall be shut, it shall not be opened, and no man shall enter by it, because the Lord God of Israel has entered by it. Therefore it shall be shut." I think you get the picture there, it's shut. He's not being particularly subtle about what's there. Now there's another scroll, of course, and that's the here, that the angels are holding as they come down. And that is, of course, the announcement to the shepherds. So you have the angels, and here are the shepherds here. And this, of course, is canonical. This is in Luke 2:8 through 11. Now there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. Then the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord." So that's the annunciation to the shepherds. And that, of course, that entire passage is not on the scroll. But what's on the scroll is actually just the first part. Behold, I bring you tidings of great joy. And that's actually a variant of the passage in Luke. So that's, again, sort of linking up the shepherds here, the New Testament, Luke, with the events that we're discussing. And then we have another image, another little narrative that's in the lower left. And this is the washing of the child, the washing of the Christ child. After the child is born, you have these handmaidens who are bathing the child. Now that is not canonical. That's nowhere in the four traditional Gospels that the child was then bathed after the birth. That comes from the Apocrypha, and that comes from the Gospel of James. It's referenced there, but also sometimes that's called the Infancy Gospel of James, which is a source of a lot of imagery related to the childhood of Jesus. And so in that text, we find this reference to these a midwife and another woman who is actually named. Her name is Salome, but it's not the other Salome. That's more infamous. And that they were there to wash the child. Now, this is interesting because it probably has other connotations. The idea of washing the child certainly relates probably to baptism, to the idea of baptism. And when you look through the four canonical Gospels, there's only one point where finally all four evangelists are telling the same story. They all tell the same story, and that's, of course, the adult baptism of Christ. That's in all four Gospels. So baptism is that story, that idea is very important. And the other thing here, when we look at works like this, we can approach them simply as sort of what I'm doing, iconographically, talking about symbolism and meaning. And I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on formal discussion of what's the difference between a Byzantine painting and a Sienese painting, something like that. But the idea of the washing of the child is also probably related to an art factor, shall we say, and that is artists wanted to challenge themselves to see if they could paint water, coming out of a picture, water in a bath. That this was a kind of a challenge for artists, so they sort of gravitated towards that subject, probably for that reason as well. Now, when we look at a detail of that particular painting, you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, once again, you see Mary, and you see the Christ child in swaddling. You see the ox and the ass, the angels up above. You see the star. But what's interesting here is there's a conflation now. We don't just have sometimes a typology, Old Testament, New Testament, but sometimes we have Orthodox versus Western. As well. And so here, when you look at the nativity, in the Western tradition, it takes place in a stable. That's what we're used to. In the Eastern tradition, it takes place in a cave. And so the artist here, Duccio, doesn't want to offend anybody, so he puts the stable in the cave, and then everybody's happy. He doesn't have to worry about that. So that's a clear reference again to how somebody in the Eastern tradition would approach this painting, somebody in the Western tradition. Duccio is a Sienese painter, but of course he's very aware of the Byzantine traditions of the East. A number of Byzantine painters, Italian painters came from Byzantium to Italy. So that's another little detail here to consider. Now, talking about this East-West kind of nexus, here you have a detail of the Nativity on the left from the Duccio painting. You see Mary, Joseph, the Christ child, the animals, the cave, the stable. And what I'm showing you on the right is, in fact, an icon. It's an icon from the East, and it's from Constantinople. And it shows the Nativity. And I think if you look at that icon on the right and compare it to the Duccio, you'll see that Duccio was taking all kinds of things from that tradition. First of all, the most obvious thing is the reclining Mary. We're used to this idea very often of Mary and Joseph kneeling next to the Christ child who's in the manger, that kind of triad. And that will come about for a reason that I'll discuss in a minute. But in the Eastern tradition, it's almost always showing Mary reclining after birth and sort of relaxing. And that is a distinctly Eastern tradition. But Duccio knows that tradition, and he incorporates it into his painting. So when you look at this painting, here's the washing of the child, here's Joseph kind of relegated to the periphery, here's Mary on this red kind of support, the manger, the animals. I mean, it just goes down the, left and right, back and forth to show the relationship here between the Eastern tradition and the Western tradition. So here's a detail of the washing of the Christ child that I've just talked about, and then also a detail of the shepherds, or the angels announcing to the shepherds. The passage that I just read to you, that comes from Luke, and we can read the scroll easily enough, believe it or not. It's not in Greek, it's in Latin. So another kind of interesting relationship. Now, when we look at this panel, this is, by the way, on a wooden panel, and it was part of a really magnificent, gigantic altarpiece that's today in Siena, except for the fact that over time, some of these smaller panels that made up this, what we would call a polyptych, it's more than 3, it has many panels, front and back, they became dispersed. And this was for various reasons. Things were stolen, lost. When this grand painting that I'll show you in a minute, the so-called Maestà, was actually put in place, which was around 1308, within a century or so, that all of a sudden everybody thought it was old-fashioned. And they took it down, put it in storage, and then things start to disappear. And so I'll come to that in a minute. But what's interesting is when you have this panel here, which is a low panel, it's rectangular, it would have been at the very bottom of the altarpiece, kind of supporting what was above it. We see the fact that Isaiah is looking out. I mean, he's on the edge and he's looking out. Technically speaking, an artist doesn't like to do that. He likes to keep everybody centered. So we tend to follow gazes and gestures. And in that case, it's interesting because Isaiah looks outward. And the only explanation, well, it's not an explanation, but the reason for that is it's quite simple to decode, and that is because it was part of a larger altarpiece. So this is the Maestà, and the exhibition that was recently at the Met and is now in London was about this particular period in Sienese painting, and there was an attempt to bring all of the dispersed panels that have gone here and there back to the Met, and then this show has traveled. So there are 13 dispersed panels from the altarpiece. 6 of them are in the United States, and 2 of them are here at the National Gallery. So we're very fortunate. But the one that you're looking at here, let me go ahead. This one is dispersed. This is at the National Gallery in London. And this would have been the painting down here that would have explained why Isaiah is looking this way, because this would have been on the end. So he wouldn't have just been looking off into space. And of course, what we have there is what I've already explained. It's a typology, because Isaiah's scroll talks about, behold, a virgin shall conceive. That's referencing directly to the message that the angel gives the Virgin Mary that you're seeing in the panel that's today at the National Gallery in London. So context is very important in an altarpiece. When you walk through our galleries, you very often, the Renaissance galleries, you very often see very small rectangular paintings, some are about the size of a sheet of notebook paper. Almost all of those would have been part of larger altarpieces that over time just those panels got dispersed, and so they're today in sundry different museums. So if we stay in Siena and just, again, if you have the time to walk through the galleries, basically I'm giving you the kind of path right here. From Gallery 1, you just continue chronologically, and you come into this gallery that houses the painting of the Annunciation. So we were just talking about the Annunciation that's in London, part of the Maestà, but this is a different artist, and this is the Sienese painter Giovanni di Paolo. And here we have an interesting painting because it is a single panel, but it has three separate sections, so it almost looks like what we would call a triptych. It has a central section, it has this section, and then it has this section, but it's all one panel. And this is the event from Luke, and this is certainly canonical, and this is the Annunciation. And this is kind of what shall we say, kicks everything off, shall we say. And here's what Luke writes, Luke 1:30-33. Then the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." So that's the Annunciation. That's what the angel is announcing to Mary, who of course is totally surprised by all of this. She hadn't been expecting this. So now she has to kind of begin to sort of process, you might say, what's going on and how she's going to respond. Now, the Annunciation scenes like this one have all kinds of iconographic tropes, we might say. So let's get a little closer here. Okay, so here's the angel. I'm going to talk about angels in a second, more specifically. But here's an angel, the angel Gabriel, announcing to Mary about this event that will be happening. And you'll notice the parallelism here. First of all, the angel has his arms crossed. By the way, angels are always male. They may look very feminine, but I'm sorry, but they're all men. So the angel is announcing to Mary this event, and the angel is humble in front of Mary, so he has his hands clasped across his chest. So it's a symbol of humility. And then you see Mary, who's seated, but she echoes that same pose. Her hands come across her chest. And her humility, the angel's humility is towards Mary. Mary's humility is towards God. So she is the sort of, we'll get into this, the idea of the handmaiden of the Lord. So that's part of the iconography in the center, which is the major part. But then we have these two lateral scenes. On the left, let me go back. On the left, we have the expulsion from the garden. And on the right, we have Joseph, who's warming himself at a fire. Now here, we can infer a number of things. There's an obvious typology. That's the easiest thing. That links up the expulsion with the Annunciation, and that is because if we hadn't been expelled from the garden, we wouldn't need Christ to come back and save us, salvation. So that's a standard typology. Old Testament expulsion, New Testament announcing of the birth of Jesus. So that's one thing. The more, and by the way, this paradise, even though they're being expelled, is just filled with rich, fecund, fertile vegetation and flowers, etc. So that's easy enough. Did I show you? Let's see. Let me go back for a second. Yeah, so here you see God the Father, and then the angels driving Adam and Eve out. Here's the gate to paradise here, and all of the sort of flora and fauna. But getting back to this, the more interesting part of the picture is Joseph, because Joseph's at the far right, and he is sort of segregated from the actual event. He's partitioned off. And unfortunately for Joseph, he's going to be like that frequently. He's going to be kicked out, go have a cigarette, whatever, and then he'll come back and things will have already happened that he will have missed. But Joseph warming himself by a fire has a number of implications. First of all, you wouldn't warm yourself by a fire unless it was winter, it was cold, fall, winter. And so there's probably a calendrical idea going on here that reinforces by this time in the 15th century that the birthday of Christ is December 25th. That's a totally arbitrary date. But once it's accepted, then you see these representations. On the other hand, with Joseph by the fire, it probably still has that calendrical idea. But fire has its own symbolism. It's a symbol of hope. It's a symbol of charity. So all of those things probably are relevant here to understanding why Joseph is where he is and what he represents. I'll come back to the idea of the calendar in a second. So here's nature and the paradise. Everybody's happy, running around, little hares and things, and really beautifully painted. This painting is not large. It's maybe a little bit bigger than a sheet of notebook paper. So it has tremendous detail. And here we come back to what I was talking about. Now I want to return to the idea of the angel. There are entire hierarchies of angels. And they're sort of like a baseball team. There are 9 of them, and each has, some are good on defense, some play, some are good in the field, some hit for power, some can steal bases. They all have different sort of things. And so this chart on the left is a representation of the hierarchies and names of the angels, names that you've certainly heard in some cases, and others that you haven't heard. So at the very top we have, of the chart there, we have the seraphim. So they're the highest form of angel. They're the highest order. They are literally the guardians of God's throne. There is a reference in Isaiah to these particular entities where it says, "Holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." That refers to these angels. So they're at the top of the chain. The next level, going down one, are probably the angels that are a little bit more prevalent in art. And those are the cherubim. So cherubim, you see the word cherub. Cherub relates to the word child. In fact, this word probably is a conflation of Hebrew and Aramaic to come up with this cherubim. So they are little baby heads. They're disembodied. They're floating around just like heads, but they have these little wings coming out of their ears. And they're light. They have light. They emanate light. So the cherub is the second highest in the ranking. They're closely linked, of course, to God's glory, etc. And they tend to be these images of power, but power manifests through this sort of innocence or childlike depiction. Now, I'm just going to read the rest of these. We don't have to analyze. Number third, hitting third, are the thrones, and the thrones are angels that are angels of pure humility and submission. Then there are the dominions, the virtues, the powers. The powers, that's position number 6, and these are the warrior angels. They fight against evil. Then we get to the principalities, and then we get to the 2 last ones, which are probably the ones we're most familiar with. And that's the archangels. And the archangel generally is meant to be the idea that they are the chief or leading angel, and they're the ones most frequently mentioned throughout Scripture. And they have, of course, a unique role because they are the messenger of God. So they bring messages. In the case of what we just looked at, the Annunciation. In the Catholic tradition, there are 3 archangels, Gabriel, Michael, and Raphael. In the Judaic tradition, there are actually 7, but in the Christian tradition, it's Gabriel who's always the messenger angel bringing this message. And then we have position number 9, and these are the angels that are closest actually to us, to the material world. In other words, if you and I see an angel, you go to bed and you see an angel, that's going to be in position 9. It's not, a cherubim is not going to come to us, a seraphim is not going to come to us. They're just busy doing other things. And it's the little angel, the last sort of angel, that would be the angels that would come to the material world and relate to human beings. They deliver the prayers of God. They answer the prayers of humans, etc. The best depiction of this idea in visual art, I think, is actually not in painting, but it's in film. And it's the film directed by Wim Wenders called Wings of Desire. It's a German film. It came out, I think, in the 90s. And it's a story about post-war Berlin. And Berlin is populated by angels who cannot be seen by anybody, but they're present. And because of the tragedy of Berlin after the Second World War, you have all of these people who are suffering in one way or another, and these angels come and sit next to somebody, maybe on the subway or maybe in the library, and they can hear the thoughts of this person saying, I don't have any money to pay my rent, et cetera, this kind of stuff. And that movie is magnificent. And you should seek it out if you're not familiar with it. It was directed, as I said, by Wim Wenders. It stars Bruno Ganz, and believe it or not, it also stars Peter Falk, who is an angel who has kind of transitioned. It's a long story, but it's a great film. This painting on the right is just a depiction. It's a painting by a Florentine painter named Francesco Botticelli, and it's the Assumption of the Virgin. The Virgin is assumed up into heaven here. This is her tomb filled with lilies. These are the apostles. Of course, the landscape here, these are the patrons who commissioned the painting. And this landscape, of course, is not heaven, it's not Jerusalem, it's essentially the Arno Valley around Florence. And so that's very common. The thing that's uncommon about this painting is that at the top, it combines angels and saints. Normally, that's not something that was done. Saints would have their own sort of space and angels their own, but in this case, they're kind of all brought together in this kind of beautifully arrayed form. Okay, so getting deeper into the Annunciation, because this is, as I said, this is the event that sort of starts everything related to the birth of Jesus. And now I want to talk about something that's very interesting and common, although people tend not to realize it or think about it until it's kind of pointed out. And that is what we call the laudable states of the Virgin Mary. This is to say that in the Annunciation, when you see the angel delivering this message, Mary responds in really 5 different ways, different her body language. And I've sort of I'm showing it to you here. I've lifted out from these Annunciation paintings. I've gotten rid of everything except the figure of Mary. And you can see, I'm going to sort of go through these and tell you what we're talking about. So, the Annunciation, I don't know if I read you that. Did I read you that passage? I don't think so. Oh, yeah, I did. The angel said, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God," etc. And so in Florentine art of the 15th century, which was dominated by Franciscan sermons and Franciscans to a large extent, there was this development of what was known as the 5 laudable conditions of the Blessed Virgin. And here they are illustrated from left to right. The first one was referred to as conturbatio in Latin, but it's simply sort of disquiet or being ill at ease. And then reflection, inquiry, submission, and merit. So if we read these things, this is the first one, disquiet, which is to say that, Mary's just having her typical day, and all of a sudden this angel flies in and tells her that she's going to bear this child, and you need to process that. So initially, she actually shrinks back. She's even frightened. And so this is a detail from Botticelli, and nobody can paint that idea of this beautiful virgin, the beautiful sinuous line, as she sort of shrieks back from this news. So that's disquiet. And then the second one, where she puts her hand up here now to her chest, one hand down, and a much quieter pose, is reflection. So, okay, she's gotten over the initial shock, and now she has to, okay, I got to think about this. What does this really mean? And then in the third from the left, is the interrogatio, which means inquiry. And here's where she goes from defense to offense. In the first two, she's defensive, she doesn't know. Then the third one, she says, okay, wait a minute, I got some questions for you. I need more information. And so then she's more open, her hand is out, she's not sort of falling back. Once she gets the explanation that this is the word of God, etc., we come to the fourth, which is humiliatio, which is submission. In other words, okay, I got it, I've heard it, okay, I'm going to submit myself to the word of God. And then the last one is, in fact, an image that isn't part of the actual Annunciation iconography, where you have the two figures. That usually is a separate format. And I'm showing you this painting on the right by Antonello da Messina, a Sicilian painter. And this last phase, shall we say, is meritatio, merit. She's gone through all these stages, this quiet, reflection, inquiry, submission, and then she kind of accepts that she's worthy, or that she merits this. So those are very common certainly in 15th century Florentine painting, but they're picked up throughout images of the Annunciation and other traditions in other places. So staying with the National Gallery and continue to just walk through, we've seen the Annunciation of a Sienese painter, Paolo, that I just showed you, and Giovanni di Paolo, and now I'm showing you the Annunciation we have on the left, that's by Masolino. Masolino is a contemporary of Masaccio, the great Florentine painter of the 15th century. They were friends, they shared commissions, so they were well aware of each other. And we have this wonderful Annunciation by Masolino. And you'll notice some of the things relating to what we just were talking about, although in this case, the angel is not, in the Giovanni di Paolo, the angel was actually standing, but with a humble pose. But here the angel is actually kneeling, and but has the same kind of humility posed here. Notice his head is lower than Mary's head, so he has a subservient position. Mary has she's not frightened here. She's in that state where she's got the message, and now she's thinking about it. But not only that, what's important here is the book. Mary has a book on her lap, and we can read the passage that's where the book is open to, and it's open to Isaiah. Every time you see Mary opening a book, it's almost always that passage in Isaiah about, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child. It's that particular passage from Isaiah. So inherently there is a typology, a New Testament, Old Testament relationship. And then we have one other element that people often ask about, and gets into some of the symbolism, and that is this. I'm showing you the Botticelli painting on the right here, because it's a little bit easier to see, but you can see it here as well, here and here. And that is a star that's on Mary's blue mantle. And that has its own sort of origin story. Mary is often referred to as the star of the sea. You probably know that term, Stella Maris. And she is the protector of, in the early days of Christianity, she's a protector of Christians, although they weren't referred to as Christians. It was the Jesus movement initially. In any case, there was discussion, debate, maybe even some tension between the Israelites and these new Christians, and the other reference to the fact that Mary has this star, and she's the Stella Maris, the star of the sea, is the fact that for most Israelites, the Christians were out to sea. They were like, this is baloney, all this stuff. And so Mary is the protectress of Christians in that respect. That's the star, the Stella Maris. That evolves eventually into, because she's related to the sea, if you walk through fishing villages in Spain or Italy or France and you look at the boats that are docked, 9 times out of 10, they're named the Stella Maris, because the fisherman is evoking the protection of the Virgin Mary out on the sea. So that's part of the explanation for this, for the star and for her particular attribute. Then we get to her colors. Everything has meaning: gestures, poses, colors, expressions, compositions. And so here she wears a red inner tunic covered by a blue mantle. And that's a typical Western. That's the tradition we're most familiar with. Blue has its biblical roots in the Old Testament, in fact, because it's actually referred to as the color of the people of Israel. Blue represents, though, transcendence, mystery, the divine, and in essence, it represents the heavens. It's a sort of heavenly color because of its reference to the sky. Red, which is underneath the blue, is an earthly color, and it's associated with blood, with the material world, with the world that we sort of live in. And so you have the blue mantle over the red sort of levels of hierarchy from the earthly to the spiritual. Now, what's interesting is in the Orthodox tradition, they flip it around. In the Orthodox tradition, Mary wears a red outer garment and a blue inner tunic. So they flip it from what we're used to in the West. But blue, in essence, symbolizes grace, heavenly grace, hope, and red, pretty much the presence of God, the blood of the martyrs, and also the fact that Mary, even when she's holding this child, has cognition, and she knows what's going to happen to this child once he grows up. And so the blood of the martyrs, the blood of the passion is already kind of implied here with the red tunic. Now, we have so many iconic, important, world-famous, quite frankly, paintings that are related to the story I'm telling you, especially in the realm of Italian Renaissance painting, so painting in Italy in the 15th and 16th centuries especially. And this is one of our most famous paintings, and it's very large. It's the Tondo, it's a round picture, painted by, we know, two artists who painted it for sure, and we think there was a third artist actually who contributed. But normally it's given to Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi. Fra means brother. Both of these individuals were monks. It was very common for monks to be artists, illustrated manuscripts, etc., but also large-scale painting. And Fra Angelico was the favorite painter of Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. And this is a Medici picture to the nth degree, and we can trace the provenance of this figure all the way back to 1492 and the death of Lorenzo de' Medici. We know it was hanging in his bedroom. In any case, we have here the subject we haven't seen yet, the Adoration of the Magi. And that's in Matthew, in two different places, Matthew 2, 1 through 2, and 9 through 11. And I've kind of conflated them here. It says, "Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they had come into the house, and they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh." Okay, there's a lot of stuff there that we sort of have to describe. First of all, they're not present at the birth of Christ. They're not there. It clearly says they come to the house. So basically, they make a house call later, and that's where they encounter the Christ child. Now, the idea so that's one sort of somewhat a kind of discrepancy here, but that was very, very common. Almost always the Magi are shown adoring the Christ child, regardless of what the scripture says. Then we have the idea of Magi. Simply, Magi is from the Persian word magus, which goes back to has an old Iranian origin. So it's Persian, and it has different meanings. In the original Persian, it meant somebody of a priestly level, a priestly caste. Later, it came to be, and when it kind of shifted into Latin and Greek, it came to be thought of as a magician, somebody who had some kind of magic power. Then we have the number 3. Nowhere in Scripture does it say that there were 3 of these guys. It doesn't say. It just says magi. So when you look at, like for example, go back and look at early Christian sarcophagi, carvings and things, you can see at times, 2, 3, 5, sometimes there's a whole football team, like 11. And so that number just kind of fluctuated until we get to the until we get to the late medieval and Renaissance, and then the number 3 kind of takes hold. And again, the church is very often, manipulating things. Okay, we need to come up with a number, and there's this reference to these 3 gifts. So, but more importantly, 3 was symbolic of the Trinity. So the number 3 then kind of caught on. And then you see in our painting and in others, but here in our painting, very often the magi are represented as 3 different ages of humanity, youth, adulthood, and old age. We have that in our painting. There's the very young one, there's the more sort of adult, and then there's the older one. Sometimes they're actually shown possessing 3 different personalities. The young one is very enthusiastic, kind of, really into it. Then we have the adult who's kind of reasonable and rational. And then we have the older magus who is always the figure of experience and patience and that. So that sometimes is relevant. And then we also have sometimes the depiction of the 3 magi as 3 different races, a European, an Asian, and an African. And we do have a painting at the gallery that shows that, and I'll show it to you in a few minutes. Now, I could go through here and begin to sort of decode and come up with why there were 3 and how it relates to other things beyond the Trinity. Jesus himself fulfilled, in the Catholic tradition, he fulfilled the sort of messianic hope of Israel. He had a 3-fold office. He was a priest, a prophet, and a king, so the number 3 is sort of relevant there. And then it goes on in other traditions. But what's interesting are some of the other elements in this painting. So when you look at this painting, it's very complicated and it's very crowded, and a lot of people are doing a lot of things. And you can see the stable here, the oxen and the ass, Mary with the Christ child, Joseph here, the 3 magi here, and this big crowd that's coming all the way around through this gate. So they start here and come around and flood into the picture this way, the fertility of the landscape. This is a great detail, because that woman with these screaming kids is at the end of the line. And she's got her hand up to her head like she's got a classic headache. And in essence, it's almost like she's saying, I don't think we're going to make it, because we got to go all the way around, and I don't think that's going to happen. So there's actually some humor here. But let's talk about, and then we have this gentleman here in the red who's here. In the passage that I read to you, of course, very prominent is the star that led the Magi. And that's what they followed. There's no star in this picture. What you can see of the sky here doesn't show anything. In fact, this is, again, a Tuscan landscape. But in any case, this sky is important because Fra Angelico is sort of implying that he sees the star. He's looking up to the heavens, and that gesture open, he's in red. Your eye just goes right to that red, especially against this blue. Red and blue are very strong contrasts. So we can infer that the star is up there. We just can't see it. Now, I mentioned that this painting has a number of hands associated with it, and the first is Fra Angelico. And Fra Angelico is, as I said, a monk. He was a Dominican monk. He was the favorite painter of Cosimo de' Medici, the sort of patriarch of the Medici family in Florence. And Fra Angelico was very, very much in demand. And so what we have here is a painting that was probably, the commission was given to Fra Angelico, he worked on it, he laid it out, but we know pretty clearly when we investigate this painting that the only thing Fra Angelico painted is Mary and the Christ child. Everything else was painted by Fra Filippo Lippi, who was another monk, who was a Carmelite and also in favor with Cosimo, although they were totally different personalities, shall we say. Fra Angelico is on the road to becoming a saint. So in Italy, he's not referred to as Fra, he's referred to as Beato, beatified Angelico. Ironically, that was John Paul II who beatified him, and then after John Paul II died, he was made a saint ahead of Fra Angelico. So he jumped the line. It should have been Fra Angelico, but that's the way things go. So he's Dominican, and there was an incredible show at the Metropolitan many years ago, just on Fra Angelico. All these major paintings were brought from Florence and elsewhere, and Fra Angelico is known for his piety, his humility, his religious fervor, and so he was the quintessential kind of devoted monk. Fra Filippo Lippi, who probably did the most work on this painting. The painting was painted in 1420 by Fra Angelico. For some reason, he set it aside. Maybe he had other commissions. And it was not picked up again until 1440, 20 years. And then Fra Filippo Lippi picked it up and pretty much finished the painting. So it's a collaboration in that sense. But we think there's actually a third artist, and I'll come to that in a minute. Here you can see, and once you've looked at a lot of paintings in terms of connoisseurship, you've looked at a lot of Fra Angelico, and you've looked at a lot of Fra Filippo Lippi, there are differences. So this is Fra Angelico, this is Fra Filippo Lippi. We come to the stable and the ox and the ass. So, okay, where the heck did they come from? The ox and the ass, why are they always present? Where did that start? They are not mentioned in the Gospels, in Luke or in Matthew. Of course, we can assume, of course, if it's a stable, it probably had animals. So is that just the reason? It just made sense to have an ox and an ass? Well, certainly, potentially, that's true. But there is a typology here, and it's in Isaiah. Isaiah is just very important to all of this nativity kind of imagery. In Isaiah 1-3, there's the line where Isaiah writes, "The ox knows its owner, and the ass its master's crib." So that's in Isaiah. So there's a reference here to the ox and the ass, having in fact different personalities, you might say. The ox knows its owner. The ox recognizes the divinity of the birth of this child. And so in almost all of these nativity scenes, the ox is present. He's very often looking at the Christ child. He seems to be aware. As opposed to the ass, the donkey, who couldn't care less and is always eating. So the ox is looking out. He seems to know what's going on. The ass just wants to eat. Now, this does have implications later for a kind of prejudicial idea about Christians and non-Christians, who recognizes the divinity of Christ and who doesn't. I'm not going to go through all of that. But the other thing that's present here in these details is this parapet, this arch, and these figures are coming around. Here's the lady who's got the headache over here. And this is a shepherd here. And so that arch is round. It's a Roman arch. But when you look at the building, it's crumbling. The parapet, the wall is falling apart. And you have these young boys, semi-nude boys, who are standing on this wall. And this becomes a stock kind of symbol for the end of the pagan world with the birth of Christ. Christianity supersedes the pagan world. Once Christ is born, the pagan world is crumbling. And that's the way it's sort of symbolically represented. The animals here, the peacock, and then there's a hawk and a pheasant on the stable here. Though the peacock has a very standard symbolism going back to antiquity, and it was an image of everlasting life. It was believed that the flesh of a peacock did not decay after death. So it had that symbolism. And what the Christians did was just adopt that and turned it into everlasting life in Christ. So they just kind of Christianized it. And then the other birds, the hawk and the pheasant here, are strictly Medici symbols. The feathers of the hawk and the pheasant are part of their escutcheon and part of their costume. So what we have going on here is a clear reference that this is a very important Medici painting, and the symbolism is inculcated into that. Now, I don't have time to go through all the way why this painting is so important, and we can trace it all the way back to the Medici. We know what they paid for it. We know how it was based on different traditions to create a round picture. The invention of a round tondo is a Florentine invention, a round picture. And round paintings were not meant to be in churches. They were meant to be in private homes or palaces. So we know everything about this painting in that regard. Now, what's interesting is that one of my colleagues who retired several years ago, Russell Sale, who was a lecturer with me, and he spent a number of years researching this painting and getting deeply into it. His specialty was actually 15th century Florentine art, and he posited that there is, in fact, a third artist who worked on this picture, and it's the artist who painted the birds, and there's that hunting dog, that kind of greyhound, if you notice, back down in the lower part. And this painting was really, it was in the lab. We looked at the X-rays, infrared, all this, where is the paint? And it's clear that the birds were painted last. They lay over everything else, and they date even later. And so Russell Sale posited that they were the work of an artist named Benozzo Gozzoli, who was at work at that time in the Medici Chapel, and that he was sort of asked to punch up the iconography of the painting to make sure people knew it was a Medici picture. And so then Russell published an article, magnificent article. And it came out in 2007 in Burlington. This is the major art history journal in England. In America, it's the Art Bulletin. In England, it's the Burlington magazine. And he took everybody through this picture, believe me, more things than you ever want to even know. But one of the great things that he did, we had a computer-generated image in which he had the tech person remove visually the birds and the dog, so show the picture without those elements. And when you do, I'm not showing you that image, but when you do see the picture without those elements, the space makes much better sense. The stable actually looks kind of weird with the birds. It looks like they're flat and just pasted on the surface. So in any case, if you want some recreational reading, this is the article that you want. And then what's interesting is how this continues. The Medici are associated with the Magi, and this is a stock connection. And it's very politically and religiously sort of important for the Medici because they see themselves as the Magi of Florence. We bring Florence gifts, power, status, prestige. So there was a tight connection between the Medici and the Magi iconography. So if we go just a generation later, after Cosimo's son is Piero, and then Piero's sons are Giuliano and Lorenzo the Magnificent. And the painter who's the most important painter for Lorenzo de' Medici is Botticelli. By that time, Fra Angelico is dead, and so is Fra Filippo Lippi. So we have another Medici painting here that is another adoration of the Magi. And this seemed to be the favorite topic, that whenever the Medici were creating or commissioning something, they wanted an adoration. So we have, again, the same kind of cast of characters, the Magi here, the Christ child, Mary, Joseph. We have servants, shepherds, etc. We have a number of things that relate to the round picture, the tondo. Now that tondo hung in the Medici Palace. So Botticelli saw that painting every day. He was there all the time. So he knew that Fra Angelico painting cold. He knew every element of it, the symbolism, etc. So here in Botticelli's case, we have a temple, a classical temple, which is not part of the story of the birth of Christ. It's supposed to be a stable, but he puts these wooden trusses within this temple, but the temple is crumbling, it's falling apart. And that's the end again of the pagan world and with the birth of Christ. And if you'll notice, everything on this side of the picture is dead or dying. Everything here is blossoming. So this transition from pagan to Christian through the figure of Christ. Now, there's another element here that seems, it's evident, but it's kind of strange, and that's these stones here. When you look at the painting, right in the path of that we would take to get to the Christ child, Botticelli plunks down these rocks. Now, one might say that, well, in the Renaissance, especially in Italy, they were very interested in nature, and they were looking at rocks and foliage and plant, and that's all very true. But plunking it down in that position makes us have to step over it visually to get deeper into the picture. And so what we probably have there is what we call stumbling stones. And there are a number of places in the literature, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, where there's this reference. But more specifically here, I think it's probably the writings of St. Jerome. And in one of his homilies, he says, "Now the stones that he bids us throw out from our way are our sins. Christ does not walk in our heart if there is any sin there. He stumbles at once against these stones." So you can't approach Christ if you're carrying sin. You will stumble. This is also in Isaiah. So we have a typology, here, talking about a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. It's in Genesis 4:7. I'm not going to read all these to you. But one of the more interesting ones is in the New Testament in Matthew. Matthew writes, "And whosoever shall fall on this stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder." So the idea of the stumbling stone is particularly important, and I think clearly that's what Botticelli is kind of inferring here. There are a number of other things. This, of course, is interesting because the classical temple is totally out of place here, but of course it's supposed to be a symbol of the pagan world. But Botticelli inserts these wooden trusses to echo and refer to the idea of the stable as we had with Fra Angelico. And then in case you're missing it, 3 comes back here. We have 3 trusses, 1, 2, 3. Each truss has 3 outer beams, and within each of the trusses are 3 other beams. So in case you're missing it, it's 3 by 3 by 3. So the whole idea, again, of the importance of the Trinity here is probably guiding Botticelli. So far, we've just been in Tuscany or in Umbria with Florence and Siena. Venice is a different story, and here we have one of the most important. Again, I'm showing you paintings in this talk that within the realm of Italian Renaissance art are among the greatest in the world, and most of them were collected and gifted to the museum by Samuel Kress after Andrew Mellon, who also contributed. In any case, this is Giorgione's Adoration of the Shepherds. So we've already seen the story going back to Duccio, where the Annunciation to the shepherds, this child has been born, go and seek out this child. And so the shepherds go ahead and seek out the child. And here, 2 of them arrive. Here's the child on the ground, Mary, Joseph, the ox and the ass back there. So we have that end of the story. Go find this child. So they found the child. But of course, the predicate, what gets them going, is the actual Annunciation, like we saw in the Duccio. And that is actually in this painting, but it's very small. It's up here. So this angel is announcing to these shepherds. So we have both parts of the story, the Annunciation and the Adoration. And this is canonical. This is in Luke. And it's Luke 2, 15 to 20. "And it came to pass, as the angels were gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds said one to another, Let us now go even unto Bethlehem and see this thing which has come to pass, which the Lord hath made known unto us. And they came with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger. And when they had seen it, they made known abroad the saying which was told them concerning this child. And all they that heard it wondered at those things which were told them by the shepherds." So that's the whole sort of approaching to the Christ child and their recognition. Now, that's standard, that's canonical, but there are some things in this painting that are interesting and relate probably to contemporary theological writings, and it's the fact that this child is not in the manger. So the scripture says manger, but the manger is the crib, where the food is, and we just talked about that. And here's the manger back here. And so the idea of Christ laying flat on the ground, sometimes with nothing under it, sometimes there's a little kind of a small kind of sort of doily, I guess you would say, and sometimes he's on the hem of Mary's gown, as we have sort of here. But the placement of Jesus now in this incredibly humble place on the ground, you can't get more humbler than that, probably comes from St. Francis of Assisi, because what his writings begin to stress is the humility of Christ. And in one of his admonitions, Francis writes, he says this: "Every day he humbles himself, just as he did when from his heavenly throne into the Virgin's womb. Every day he comes to us and lets us see him in lowliness, when he descends from the bosom of the Father into the hands of the priest at the altar." So that's St. Francis writing about the humility of Jesus. By the way, before I forget, these are cherubim. They're just those little disembodied baby heads casting light. You'll notice in Venice, because Venice is the nexus between the East and the West. Venice trades through the Adriatic with the East as well as with the West. So a Venetian would have no problem with this event taking place in a cave. And that is the Eastern tradition, as we talked about earlier. Now, there are two sources here, probably. Well, there are probably three things going on here. But this idea of the humility of the Christ child is certainly from St. Francis, but it also relates to the revelations of St. Bridget of Sweden. And I'll come back to that in a second. So what we have now is a tradition that begins with Francis at this time, and it is the development of what today is called the Christmas creche, or a real nativity scene. There are many, many images of the birth of Jesus, just Jesus and Mary. We saw one of those earlier with Duccio. But what begins to happen now is what we're familiar with today, which is a nativity scene. Multiple characters: the Christ child, Joseph, Mary, shepherds, the three kings, an ox and an ass. Everybody builds the little creche. That comes from Francis. So we know the story of the Christmas creche with St. Francis of Assisi, and it begins literally in the year 1223. In the year 1223, Francis, who did not want to have a large hermitage, was basically preaching from the countryside, out in nature. He was in the town of Greccio. Greccio is near Rome, just north of Rome. He was there on Christmas Eve to celebrate Christmas Eve, and people came from all around to worship with him. And he decided, in part because his hermitage was just too small to accommodate everybody, they all kind of went out into the field. And then what happened was Francis decided to create a living creche. Now, what you're looking at here is a photograph from 1972 in Rome, because what started in 1972 in Rome is the presentation every year on Christmas Eve in Greccio of this living scene. So you have real people, real animals, you have a real baby. They borrow the costumes from the Rome opera. So they all dress up in the various characters, and they have a service out in the countryside. Now, we know about that, interestingly enough. Francis didn't really write about that, and who wrote about it was St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure was the first biographer of Francis, and he writes the life of St. Francis in 1263, and he actually lays out this event word for word. So St. Bonaventure writes, quote, "It happened in the third year before his death that in order to excite the inhabitants of Greccio to commemorate the nativity of the infant Jesus with great devotion, Francis determined to keep it with all possible solemnity, and lest he should be accused of lightness or novelty, he asked and obtained the permission of the sovereign pontiff. Then he prepared a manger and brought hay and an ox and an ass to the appointed place. The brethren were summoned, the people ran together, the forest resounded with their voices, and that venerable night was made glorious by many and brilliant lights and sonorous psalms of praise. The man of God, St. Francis, stood before the manger, full of devotion and piety, bathed in tears and radiant with joy. The Holy Gospel was chanted by Francis, the Levite of Christ. Then he preached to the people around the nativity of the poor king, and being unable to utter his name for the tenderness of his love, he called him the Babe of Bethlehem. So that is Francis creating the first truly nativity creche scene. It's an actual living tableau. He brings everybody there. Somebody got a baby, bring them over here. Go get an ox, go get an ass. Let's all kind of get together. And that becomes now what we know in the tradition. Now, so this is a photograph of real people. This is not a painting. This is actually at Duccio in 1972. This is interesting because this ensemble of sculptures by Arnolfo di Cambio, who is a Florentine, is a nativity group. And as far as we can tell, this is the very first time that an artist represents the entire cast of characters for a nativity, different than just the birth of Jesus. So here we have the Madonna and Child, we have the shepherd, we have an ox and an ass. Of course, these are fragments today. And we have the kings as well. The one thing that's not sort of relevant here is, in fact, the figure of the Madonna and Child, because we've lost the original one that Arnolfo carved. So this is a later version. You can see the difference stylistically. And this came about in 1291. In 1291, it was Pope Nicholas IV, who was, in fact, the first Franciscan pope. We just had a Franciscan pope, remember, with Pope Francis. And it was Pope Nicholas who commissioned Arnolfo di Cambio to create a nativity scene. And today, this is in the oratory of a church in Rome. And so, as far as we know, this is the very first time you see that kind of ensemble. Here's a detail of some of the figures. Now, just continuing the story, of course, at one point in Matthew, we come across the flight into Egypt. So this is our painting by Carpaccio of the flight into Egypt. This is canonical, this particular event. It's in Matthew 2:13-14. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him." When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. So here we have a standard flight into Egypt. It's canonical in Matthew. It's a Venetian painting, so nothing in that landscape relates to anything in the Middle East. And in fact, it doesn't relate to anything in Tuscany. It is a pure dream. The Venetians, of course, love landscape, mainly because they don't have any. And so when they step out of their palazzo, they fall into a canal. So you find among Venetian painters of this period, Giorgione, Titian, Carpaccio, the Bellinis, you find them wanting to create these Arcadian landscapes. And this relates directly back to the Roman poetic tradition of the Arcadian landscape, usually peopled with shepherds, and it has this whole Roman tradition. So when you look at these Venetian paintings, the landscapes are almost always just, I wish we had a landscape like that. Again, the other thing here is this gown, this garment. When we look at historical sort of situations and documents and whatnot, the Holy Family would have been considered today sort of upper middle class, but that would have been certainly still relatively poor. Carpenter was a very, very exalted position. It goes back to the Greek word tekton. He was considered like an it was a very important position. But even given that, this family would not have had the money to have a garment like this. And so what you have here is a typical, I take this from playing poker, it's a tell. What Carpaccio is doing here with that garment, he knows it has nothing to do with trying to be accurate historically. It's an oil painting. The Venetians are absolutely in love with oil painting. And Carpaccio just wants to show you how good he is, you know. This is like an advertisement. Look at what I did. I took oil paint and I made this garment look like it's this satin and silk and color, and you know, it's a pure kind of self-homage. Now, in the 15 minutes that I have left, and I'm not going to go beyond, it's a long story. In any case, there is a painting that you need to see, and I really encourage you to go into the gallery to see, especially this painting, because it was cleaned. This is a painting by Piero di Cosimo, The Visitation, and we did a large Piero di Cosimo exhibition several years ago, and for that exhibition, we took the time to clean this painting. So it is in absolutely beautiful condition. The story is The Visitation. It is canonical. It's in Luke 1:39 to 43. And it's the story of when Elizabeth, Mary and Elizabeth are cousins, and it's when Mary visits her cousin. And then Elizabeth, who is well beyond the age of childbearing, realizes that, in fact, she is now pregnant. And so in Luke it says, "Now Mary arose in those days and went into the hill country with haste to a city of Judah, and entered the house of Zacharias and greeted Elizabeth. And it happened when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary that the babe leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. Then she spoke out with a loud voice and said, 'Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. But why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me?' So she now, as soon as Mary greets her, she feels a child in her womb. And of course, she will give birth to John the Baptist, who will be Jesus' cousin. So that's sort of implied here. But this painting goes well beyond just that story, because we have it flanked by two saints, St. Anthony Abbot, considered one of the first monastic saints, and St. Nicholas over here of Myra from Turkey. And then in the background, and again, this painting is large. So here we've got a large painting. And you can see everything back here. And when you look at the back, you can see the entire story almost that we've just been discussing. We have the adoration of the shepherds. Coming down this hill are the Magi. Over here is the massacre of the innocents. And everything is kind of represented here. So here are the details. I like this shot of the bald head of Nicholas here. So there's the adoration of the shepherds. Here. On the other side, we have a city with architecture, and we have a church here. And what he represents is the Annunciation as a fresco on this church. So you've got that story as well. Here come the Magi, that could be a song, coming down here, right? And here's the massacre of the innocents. This is what causes Joseph and Mary to flee on the flight into Egypt because of the prediction that Herod now is going to massacre all of the firstborn. And you have some real gruesome things going on here. Children who are being stabbed and clinging to the edge of things. Now, this painting is magnificent, and it is, it's so beautifully painted, and it has so much richness in terms of both its formal content and its symbolism. So here's Anthony Abbot. Anthony Abbot founds a religious order, a monastic order that takes care of people who have plague, who have terminal illness. And so his order goes out to minister to people who nobody else wants to even get near, people essentially who have plague. And so when his order goes out into the streets, I can't really see it. They have a bell to ring the bell to warn people that they're coming, and you might not want to be on that street. He has a walking stick here, and then there's this hog back here with these bristles in gold. At a certain point, Anthony, his monastery was going under financially, and so he wrote to the Pope and said, "I need a source of income." And how about if can I raise hogs? Can I become a swineherd? And the Pope said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So then Anthony began to raise, the monks began to raise hogs, and they would sell them. And that's how they maintained their monastery. So his attribute, in addition to the bell and this is a Tau cross, it's not a Latin cross, and it's not a Greek cross, it's a cross in the shape of a T here. So that became his attribute, because everybody saw him always with these hogs. And it was interesting because a lot of people, they picked up on this and they, what's going on there? Every time this guy walks down the street, there are a bunch of hogs following him. And then it was decided, the swineherds, people who actually made a living doing that, decide, well, this guy should be our patron saint. He seems to have a real rapport. So that's another aspect of Anthony Abbot. But Nicholas is maybe the more interesting one because of all of the implications for the Christmas story. And so here is Nicholas. He's reading, and we know what he's reading. He's reading from the Apocrypha. He's reading from the Book of Wisdom, and what is written on his book is, love justice, you that are the judges of the earth. Think of the Lord in goodness and seek him in simplicity of heart. Now, Nicholas was the bishop in Turkey, of Myra. And the city of Myra had tremendous sort of poverty. And Nicholas heard the story when he was in Myra as the bishop of a family, a gentleman who had lost his wife. He was now by himself, and he had to raise 3 daughters. He didn't have any money for their dowry. That could have meant that they would have to be sold as slaves or go into a horrible life. And so Nicholas heard this story. And so the story of Nicholas is that on a given night, he came to the house of these 3 girls and their father, and they were getting ready to go to bed. They'd taken off their stockings, put them on the floor, and Nicholas came. Sometimes it's references to a bag of gold, but more often it's gold balls. There are 2 here, one in front of the other, and here. And what he did was pop them right into the stocking. So here he is. This is a great picture from the Met. Sorry, I'll get to that one in a second. So here's Nicholas. He's climbing up on the outside to the window. He's got his balls saying, boom, boom, boom. And so when these girls awaken, their stockings are filled with gold. And that takes care of their dowry, et cetera. Everybody's happy. News spreads about Nicholas, who seems to have this real concern for the poor and for the dispossessed, for children. There's another story that is a real hoot, and it's this one. And this story is actually mentioned in Jacopo Voragine. It's Nicholas and the pickling of 3 boys. And the story here was that in Myra, there was a horrible famine. Everybody was starving. And there was little that could be done. And a shop owner seduced these 3 young boys to come into the shop, and then he chopped them up with an axe into various pieces, and then he threw the pieces into 3 barrels so they could be pickled, and then he sold them to the people during the famine. Of course, nobody knew the source of this meat, so that's the story. That probably is a combination of a couple of different stories. But here is the same artist, Bicci di Lorenzo, that I mentioned, who did the Met painting. Here he is. Here's Nicholas. Here are the 3 guys in the barrel. And he's saving them. He comes to the shop and then kind of reassembles them, and all is good. What this reminds me of has nothing to do with this painting. This reminds me of the movie by the Marx Brothers, Monkey Business, where they're stowing away in 3 barrels in the cargo area of a ship. But that's my own kind of. Getting back to Nicholas here, you'll notice these the balls very prominent, and then you'll notice this flower. Here's the bell of Anthony Abbot. Here's the flower. The flower is a wallflower, and that is symbolic. Wallflowers were used to create a kind of herbal tea, or sometimes an herbal sort of, basically like a tea to give to women in childbirth. It was supposedly to ease the pain of childbirth. So both of these women are pregnant. And so the wallflower relates to that. The Book of Wisdom, and then the three balls here. Now, what happens is that in the tradition in Europe, attached to Nicholas, is that he's seen as this bishop who's very concerned about children. He's concerned about gift giving and protecting children. And so as the years progress, today in Europe, very often what children get in their stocking is an orange. And the orange is symbolic of these three balls. This is especially true in the Netherlands. So the reference, the idea of Nicholas with these three golden balls is carried on today in European traditions where oranges are placed in the stockings of young children. Of course, once the Dutch come to the New World, essentially to Manhattan, they bring this character of Nicholas with them, and he's known as Sinterklaas, right? Saint Nicholas, Sinterklaas in Dutch, and then of course he becomes in our language he becomes Santa Claus, and then he becomes the character we know later, drawn by Thomas Nast, who creates the image of the guy with the suit and all that stuff. So this is the tradition, though. It comes back here. Now I'm going to skip. I got 4 minutes. I'm going to skip over this. These shepherds, and this is not a painting we own. This is a very famous painting, the Portinari altarpiece in the Uffizi, and I was going to talk about the shepherds here, but they're going to have to wait. We begin to see nocturnal scenes of the Nativity. This is new, and this equates, and this comes very strongly from St. Bridget, because when in her revelation, St. Bridget recounts the birth of Jesus, and in this revelation, she is literally at the birth. So she's present. And in her revelation, she talks about this child as total light, that the light from the child emanated so strongly. And so in painting, this begins to manifest itself, especially in nocturnal scenes, where the Christ child himself seems like the sun or a strong light. Here's the announcing to the shepherds up here. And then the adoration here. We have this painting by Savoldo that shows another nocturnal where Jesus is equated with light here. And in fact, in this painting, I don't think he's just equated with light. I think he's equated with heat because this guy's kind of warming his hands by the fire here. You have different ages of the shepherds, and this is the shepherds. We have three magi. And we have three shepherds, and it's the shepherds who are closest to us. They are us. We are not exalted magi. We are like the shepherds. So that is sort of the connotation of the three shepherds. Another nocturnal scene. These are all paintings we have at the National Gallery here in the Venetian section. This is Jacopo Bassano. The shepherds being told about the birth of Jesus. This is interesting. It's not a painting we have, but it's a painting from Toledo of the Madonna and Child, because this refers again almost directly to the revelations of St. Bridget. Bridget talks about exactly how Jesus is born, and one of the best parts of it is that Mary sends Joseph out. And so he goes out, sort of like to have a smoke or something, and when he comes back, everything's done. And Mary looks great. She doesn't have to recline, like in that Byzantine painting. She doesn't need to recuperate. And this is from Bridget. Bridget talks about this immaculate, immediate birth, and Mary does not suffer at all. It's a painless birth. And that's why we then get the image that we know today very often of Mary and Joseph next to the manger. Mary doesn't look like she went through childbirth. Here again, and remember the ox and the ass? So they're up here, the ass is eating, and the ox is looking down. This is a Petrus Christus painting. Remember, I mentioned the three ages of man, three races of the Magi, African, Asian, and European. Asian here because he wears a funny hat. They didn't really know what Asian people look like. So I think they're kind of exotic. So let's put a hat on here. This painting is very rich in iconography, and I can't go through it all because now it's 2:30. I'm going to turn into dust. This changes things dramatically because it's an adoration of the shepherds. But now the Christ child is not on the ground, nor is he in a manger. He's on an upturned basket here. And this is probably a representation of the first Mass, shall we say, a devotional Mass in which the altar is, Jesus is on the altar. But more importantly is what's going on back here. And here you see it. You have all these people running around a big bonfire. And this relates directly to the tradition of the Yule log and the fear of the coming of the darkness with winter and bringing this log, part of this log, into your house. And this begins to associate, in terms of the calendar, when might be the best date to give for Jesus' birth. And even though Scripture, for example, the shepherds are minding their flocks at night, they don't do that in the winter. That's springtime. That's the lambing season in the spring. During the winter, the shepherds, all the sheep would be in a corral. So the date of December 25th is just an expedient date that different popes come up with, and you'll have to read about that for yourself. And then here, this is a painting that people don't see because it's kind of tucked deeply into the Flemish and German galleries, and if you don't really keep moving deeper, you tend to miss this painting. It's small, but not too small. And this is the rest on the flight into Egypt. And here, first of all, this is one of the most beautiful paintings at the National Gallery. It's absolutely stunning. It's by Gerard David, a Flemish painter. Here, the rest on the flight into Egypt, there is no canonical source for that. There is the flight into Egypt. Matthew mentions that. But there's no mention that at a certain point they take the exit and decide to have a picnic and rest. That's totally apocryphal. And we know where it comes from. It comes from the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. And it's one of the most beautiful passages, and unfortunately, I don't really think I have time to read it to you, in which, what the hell? It's worth hearing because it's so beautiful. I'll kind of edit as I go along. So on the third day, they rest on their journey. Mary is very tired from the heat in the desert, although this doesn't look like a desert. And she sees a palm tree. Of course, there's no palm tree here because the sky is Flemish. They don't have palm trees in the Netherlands. And so Mary says to Joseph, "Let me rest a little under the shade of this tree." And then she's sitting there, and then she sees all this fruit, and she says to Joseph, "I wish it were possible to get some of the fruit of this palm." And then Joseph, who isn't into climbing trees, says, "I wonder that thou sayest this when thou seest how high the palm tree is, and that thou thinkest of eating of its fruit. I'm thinking more of the want of water, because the skins are now empty, and we have none wherewith to refresh ourselves." So the baby Jesus is hearing all of this, this debate over the fruit and the tree and how we're going to get it and what is it, you know. So then Jesus speaks, the child speaks, and he says, "O tree, bend thy branches and refresh my mother with thy fruit." And immediately this tree bends down so Joseph can take the fruit from it. Now, in the pseudo-Matthew, it is, what did I just say? It's a palm tree, so it's dates. But there are no palm trees in the Netherlands. So the tree here is a chestnut tree. And then Joseph isn't going to climb it. He's going to knock the branches with a stick to make the chestnuts fall, so he doesn't have to climb the tree. And then, as the scripture goes, once the fruit is collected, Jesus then talks to the tree again, and he says, "Raise thyself, O palm tree, and be strong, and be the companion of my trees which are in the paradise of my Father, and open from thy roots a vein of water which has been hid in the earth, and let the waters flow, so that we may be satisfied from thee." So the tree goes back to being upright, and then this little spring of water opens up down here. This is their picnic basket. They're giving the ass a rest here. He's eating moss. Here's the picnic back. And then we have this array of flowers across the bottom. So here's the Christ child. This is one of the most magnificent parts of this painting. The subtlety of the hair, the veil, the light, it's breathtakingly beautiful. Here's the detail of Joseph knocking on the tree. And here across the bottom are an array of flowers, and they all have meaning, of course. We have, from left to right, we have plantain, which is used as a way of staunching a blood flow, sort of like a compress. We have plantain used to staunch the flow of blood. We have mint, which is a symbol of virtue. We have red strawberries, symbolic of Jesus' blood. We have a three-leafed fern, which is symbolic of the Trinity, and also in its kind of fork-like shape, meant to ward off the devil. And then we have violets at the far right, which are a symbol of humility. Now, you should seek this painting out and look at it in real life, but I want to end with something a little off cuff here, and that's music. Normally, in the past when I've given this talk, I've actually played music at the end, and you know that there are a lot of important Christmas oratorios and things we're very familiar with, Messiah by Handel, the Bach or Christmas oratorio, but a work that doesn't get as much play as it should, and it is in fact literally the story we just were telling, but it's put to music, is the L'Enfance du Christ by Berlioz. And so look at what this company put on their cover. They put our painting on their cover of originally the LP and now the CD here. This literally tells the story of that we've been discussing, and there are two very, very famous passages. A choir where the shepherds sing farewell as Mary and Joseph and the child are about to leave and set out for Egypt. And then even more importantly is this solo by the tenor who sings what you see here on the right. And the Berlioz is just a phenomenally beautiful work. It's not as well known perhaps as Messiah and some of the other works, but this is a work you should seek out. And there's a great YouTube video of this, a live performance from Saint-Denis in Paris, which was conducted by James Conlon, and it was done in 2013. It was done as a tribute to the conductor Colin Davis, who had died in 2013. And that performance is the one I normally would play. And so you can seek that out very easily on YouTube. James Conlon, the Orchestre de Paris in France at Saint-Denis. So have a happy holiday.